Hello, language enthusiasts. We're glad you could make time to join us today for another episode of your go-to podcast for anything African language. My name is Grace Hamwajiman, and it's always a pleasure to come your way. Today's episode is definitely one to look out for because our conversation today is one that concerns everybody, but especially if you fall into the big circle of the unemployed in Ghana or Africa, or if you are a labor markets player, then you don't want to flip this channel. It's a big house today because I have three wonderful resource persons to share their insightful research into multilingualism and how it impacts on employment or one's ability to get a job in Ghana and by far Africa. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Welcome to Africa's LSP podcast, where we explore the world of translation, interpretation, and localization, as well as connect with the language industry's top players. From language service providers to the businesses and individuals who rely on their services, we'll be delving into the challenges, opportunities, and trends shaping the industry. Join us as we discover the power of language and the impact it has on connecting Africa and the world. Brought to you by Bolingo Consult, Africa's LSP podcast is the go-to podcast for all things language in Africa.
So welcome back. My name again is Grace Hamwajiman, and we're going to have an exciting conversation today. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and it's good to have you join us today. Well, my listeners and I are itching to hear from all of you because the topic about unemployment, employment is a dear one to Africa's youth. So let me begin by asking you to introduce your beautiful selves to us.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Angela Gayton and I work at the University of Glasgow. I'm in the linguistics department here. And I guess my contribution to this particular part of the research and this paper that we're going to be talking about today is from an applied linguistics perspective. I'm really interested in all things to do with multilingualism.
Perfect. So my name is Elvis ResCue. I'm currently a senior research officer at the Department of Language and Linguistics, University of Essex here in the UK. And of course, my research background, it's in applied linguistics, language contact, and also interested in human resource management more broadly. And in terms of my contribution to this project, coming in more or less similar to Angela in that case, looking at how multilingualism can really inform studies on language use in the informal sector. And that is kind of the perspective that I brought on board as part of the research team.
Nice. So I'm Colin Reilly. I'm a lecturer in linguistics in the Division of Literature and Languages at the University of Stirling. And most of my research looks at language policies in multilingual contexts. So I'm interested in how language policies can either enable or inhibit individuals' ability to access services and institutions. So in terms of this project, something that I'm quite interested in is thinking about like labour market opportunities and economic opportunities and how people's linguistic backgrounds sort of influence their ability to engage with different opportunities for work.
Well, it's amazing to see how your different backgrounds have all come together to culminate into this all-important research. So let me begin with Colin. What was the factor that pushed you into this research?
So I suppose for me, the main motivation, quite broadly, is that often in multilingual contexts, so quite a lot of my research has been in educational contexts in Africa. And in lots of those contexts, English is often kind of promoted as the valuable language for people's lives, and other languages and the sort of like multilingual realities of individuals and of communities is often ignored. So education systems are basically designed around giving people English language skills because the idea is that students will finish secondary school, go on to university, graduate university, and then end up in sort of like white collar jobs where they just speak monolingually in English all the time. And these sort of, I think, two issues with that. So one of the issues is that it doesn't really reflect the reality of education or the labour market. So like in this study, we were looking at Ghana. So the educational reality in Ghana is 35% of students finish secondary school, and 80% of the labour market are in the informal sector. So people predominantly are working in informal kind of economic jobs. And then a kind of other important reality that it ignores is the multilingual reality. So it just kind of promotes this kind of artificial monolingualism, which doesn't account for how individuals are multilingual and how they might use their multilingualism in their daily lives and in their work, or thinking about like community or like national level multilingualism either. So I suppose really broadly, that is one motivation for me being interested in this. And I think from a research perspective, there is a real lack of language focus in economics research. So not much attention is paid to language, and where there is attention paid to language, it's often from quite a monolingual perspective, so it doesn't really consider multilingualism in a great amount of detail. So I suppose something that we were interested in was to try to explore more what the reality of multilingualism is in Ghana and in the sort of different sectors of the labour market.
So Angela, I see you nodding. Maybe you'd want to add something to what Colin said, and then probably talk to us about the methodology.
Yeah, I can build on what you've said by talking a little bit about how we went about trying to better understand this multilingual reality. I can talk a little bit about the methodological approach we took in our study, basically how we researched what we wanted to understand. So our starting point was the World Bank's STEP survey, and STEP stands for Skills Towards Employability and Productivity. And this STEP survey collected data about adult skills in 17 low and middle income countries. And the Ghana sample, which of course was our particular focus, collected data from almost 3,000 participants. And I think this really speaks to what Colin has already mentioned. So the STEP survey captures data relating to labour market participation and language knowledge and use. And these were the key things that we were really interested in looking at, and specifically how the two of these things interacted, how they connected with each other. And in coming to this STEP data set, we were starting from the belief, as Colin, as I say, has already mentioned, that the relevance of linguistic, so even specifically multilingual repertoires, the relevance for understanding these for economic activity and someone's contributions that they make to the workplace, these are often not so well prioritised or not so well understood. So our own analysis of this STEP data focused on languages used at work, and we were also interested in understanding what the data showed about how an individual's linguistic group, so the one that they were born into, how this dictated their life outcomes, what their life became. And the big questions, therefore, that framed our analysis of this STEP data were two things. So we wanted to know what languages are used at work in Ghana, and we also wanted to know how can we better investigate the visibility of languages in the workplace? These were the two things that we really wanted to try to understand with the research that we were doing. So to answer these two questions, we started from an interest in understanding what these Ghanaian survey participants reported as being their mother tongue. And we used this starting point to then explore how someone's mother tongue identification interacted with a series of different variables relating to employment. So this was things such as employment rates, both in formal and informal working sectors, according to different linguistic groups. We're interested also in earnings by linguistic group, and we're interested about the languages actually used at work, again, both in the formal and informal sectors. And finally, we're interested in whether those who used English at work earned more compared to those who used other languages. And I think that really responds to what Colin has said about the fact that in certain contexts, English can really be valued or prioritised in a specific way. And we wanted to pick that apart a little bit more and try to understand this reality. So I think Colin and probably Elvis as well, they're going to talk in detail about the specific findings of our work. So I won't go into too much detail about this right now. But suffice to say that overall, what our analysis of the data showed was that Ghanaian workplaces, both in the formal and informal contexts, they're very multilingual spaces. So it's not a monolingual space. It's a place where lots of different languages are being used. And what was really interesting was that our analysis showed that there was a sense of English not being the only one of Ghana's languages which has prominence and worth in this labour market context. But as I say, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about the findings in a minute. And before we move on, something that I'm really interested in is trying to think about how we can better research these aspects of people's multilingual realities. So, of course, I want to make the point that we're viewing this STEP data as an invaluable resource for gaining insight into issues relating to linguistic, specifically multilingual repertoires and employment practices and outcomes. But there are some limitations with this survey data that we think are worth keeping in mind for future research. So the first thing to point out is that there are certain key terms that people might think are easy to understand or unproblematic, but in fact they're terms which are contested or ambiguous or understood differently in different contexts. And these are things like multilingual, mother tongue. These can be understood really differently by different individuals. They may not mean the same thing to different people. And I think this is a problem when you use them in a survey. And it's the case that people might be interpreting them and therefore responding to them in very, very different ways. And another point is that it's actually quite difficult to determine how people make claims or choose not to make claims to knowing a specific language. What does it mean to know a particular language? So, for example, I've learned different languages throughout my life, and there are some languages I speak better than others. How much proficiency do I need in a particular language to be able to say that I know it? Is it enough to say a few key words and phrases, or do I really need to be fluent in a language before I say that I know it? And it's these complexities that people who are responding to such survey tools will also be thinking about. And again, it's likely that people will fill in these surveys in different ways. What it means for one person to know a specific language might be interpreted differently for someone else. And finally, it's really difficult to capture in any kind of survey tool the complex reality of people's multilingual repertoires. So we think, and I'm sure we'll come back to this point as well, we think it's an open question for researchers moving forward, how we can better develop such tools so that people who are responding can share the messy reality, if you like, of their language use, on the understanding that people's language use practices are really quite fluid in the way that they move between different languages. So with this in mind, we conclude our paper by talking about a few key points for research moving forward, things that other researchers might want to be thinking about. So it's things like using scenario-based questions, which might be a better way of precisely capturing the way that people use these myriad languages within their multilingual repertoires in different spaces with different people. And we also point out that such survey tools need to be better adapted to the multilingual reality of any specific given context, rather than expecting that one single tool would be appropriate for use in very different multilingual countries all around the world. So I think that's kind of a summary of what we did with this data, and I think we'll move on.
Well, so for someone who has lived most of my life in the capital city here in Accra, I totally agree with Angela on the fact that the Ghanaian workplace, either formal or informal, are multilingual. Great stuff you share with us today. Colin, you want to add on again?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a really good summary as well, because I think for me, for this project, there was like the two important parts. So like one of the parts was the analysis of the STEP data, but then there was the part that probably the three of us were more involved in was like the critique of the data, which I think just in terms of this project, because it's such a initial stage, part of the reason for doing it is because this type of data doesn't really exist, and that's one of the reasons we used the STEP survey, because it's one of like the rare data sources where we have information on like sort of labour market characteristics plus language skills and language use. So like to see what's there is really useful. But then, as you mentioned, like part of the challenge is to think about how we can more effectively capture this type of data. So I think that was quite an interesting part to be thinking about.
So Elvis, you have been quiet for a while. Let me come to you. We know this research took a lot of interdisciplinary teams and workings. How did you come by these teams, and how was it like working together?
Absolutely. Just to follow up on the methodological issues that yourself, Colin, and Angela mentioned before coming to the experience of working with the interdisciplinary team is the fact that our key contribution to the discourse, and particularly methodological issues on language within multilingual context, is the fact that we were able to, as much as we engage with the STEP data, we also try to develop like research tools like questionnaires and interview protocols that enable us to uncover all the nuances that kind of characterize people's linguistic repertoire. And in the labor market, it's sometimes thought that English being the official language of countries like Ghana means that English is holding a strong economic power when it comes to the GDP growth of the country. But using different methodological approaches would definitely help us to uncover all the nuances, as Angela, you mentioned, and as well as Colin, in order to understand the multiple perspectives and how people navigate their linguistic repertoire in order to be able to achieve economic independence, gain employment, and so on. So I think our research really, I would say, had contributed significantly when it comes to language use and within a multilingual context like Ghana. And this leads to the point on how working within interdisciplinary teams could help us to kind of explore these complex nuances and more so interesting nuances when it comes to multilingualism within multicultural, multilingual countries like Ghana. And first of all, like we had a very great team, people with a linguistic background, applied linguistics more broadly as well, and people with background in economics, and as well as issues pertaining to development studies. That really brought a critical perspective into how best we can uncover the complexities. So, for instance, my background was or is in applied linguistics, multilingualism, language policy and planning, and so on. But then working within a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary group like ours help us, all of us, to think about how best we can explore the complexities of multilingualism and how best our skills can help us to explore things either quantitatively and more so quantitatively. So these are the ways I think that being part of a multidisciplinary team or more so interdisciplinary teams really help us to achieve that goal. So basically that's what I could contribute to that in that perspective.
Okay, so Colin, you want to add on?
I think those are really important things to think about, because I think like this research, because like sort of essentially is like big, in terms of the big disciplines coming together, it's language and economics, but then obviously we've got all these sub-disciplines. And you could do this project, like we could have just done this ourselves as linguists, and the economists could have just done a thing looking at this just from an economic perspective. But I think it's such a big issue and such a complicated problem that to do it effectively, you have to do it interdisciplinary. And I think it just brings in more perspectives and better ways to understand the data we're looking at, understand the questions we want to ask, and gives us more interesting answers. And then it's probably worth pointing out at this stage that we don't have any of our economist colleagues with us today, because I think part of the interesting sort of aspects of working in such an interdisciplinary way is that you sort of do have to navigate kind of different ways of understanding understanding knowledge, or like even understanding and like how things should be done, and stuff like that. 'Cause I remember when we had a team meeting at one point with like most of the wider team there, we sort of split up into groups in the afternoon based on like disciplines. So me and Elvis were working together on like the language aspects of it, and I think we spent like an hour working out how we were going to define language during the study. Yeah, and then like obviously an important, like based on what you were saying, Angela, like an important thing that we have to think about. But then I remember just being like, I don't think the economists are talking about this. I think they'll be talking about like complicated sums and stuff like that. But yeah, potentially worth also just mentioning who our colleagues were that we were working with on the project, because it was quite a big team and it was great to work with so many different people. So obviously the three of us from the kind of linguistic background, and then we also had Rosario Scandura, Kristen Hermanson, Henry Telly, Simon Bawakileno, Edwin Atzi. I'm gonna have to read. I'm gonna have to read my writing better. Yeah, and then Gabriel Aboyadana as well. So like a really nice big team of people who all managed to bring sort of different things to the project, which was really nice.
Okay, Angela, let's hear you also on this. So it looks like you have something to share also about the getting all the teams together.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think that's a really helpful response to that question about this interdisciplinary way of working. And for me, I think it's also, it illuminates how language comes into so many different aspects of people's lives in any given context. The fact that it comes into issues or economic issues, I guess that's the key example that we would be looking at with our paper. It's often something that is, as Colin has already mentioned, it's often something that's overlooked. People don't really think about the ubiquity of language in so many different domains. But I think that is what is perhaps implicitly represented by this interdisciplinary team is the relevance of language, the pertinence of language.
All right. Great stuff. I'm excited about the fact that you had a lot of people coming from different backgrounds, gathering the data, but it all came out so beautifully. And it's already painting the actual picture of how Ghana's workplace looks like. So Colin, now share with us the details of the findings. What did you come about? How easy was it? What picture did it paint? Does it reflect what is happening currently on the Ghanaian markets now? Share with us.
Yeah, so for me, the really interesting stuff that came from the survey, and sort of, I suppose, linking back to what our motivation was at the start. So this idea that English is the valuable language of economic opportunity for individuals in Ghana. And then this obviously has implications for language and education policies. But then from our analysis of the STEP survey, we find like quite clearly so more than half of respondents note that they use multiple languages in the workplace. So just straight off the bat, we can say the data shows that the labour market in Ghana isn't monolingual. So to just treat the labour market as monolingual doesn't reflect the reality. And then also quite clearly we see that languages other than English feature quite predominantly in the labour market. So just maybe to pull out some of the actual statistics. So individuals were basically asked what languages they use regularly at work, and they could select up to 3. So like the primary language, the secondary language, and then like a third language if they use that. So overall, Can was the most dominant language used at work. So 57% of respondents selected a Can as the primary language they use at work, and 21.9% of respondents selected English. We see, probably unsurprisingly, there is a difference between people in the formal labour market and the informal labour market. So in the formal labour market, people people highlight that English is used by about 71.5% of respondents as the primary language, with a can being used by 22% as their primary language for work. And then this sort of flips in the informal labour market. So in the informal labour market, we see that a can is the primary language for 64% of the workforce, and then English is the primary language for 12% of the workforce. So I think probably, like, and Elvis, you're more familiar with the Ghanaian context than us, so like probably not necessarily surprising stats there for people familiar with the context, but I think important because it shows it's not just like some sort of simple linguistic situation that we find. It's not just the case that we can say English is the only language people use at work, which is clearly not what happens. And there are complexities, and these complexities depend on the type of jobs that people are doing as well.
Okay, because Elvis is familiar with the Ghanaian background, I think he might also have something to add about this. Elvis, is this true? You went to the KNUST, even in school and around the official places. Did this play out just as it is playing out in your research? Do you see a colleague and say, oh, what are saying, hello, tachobote, hello, tete? Do you do that? Okay, share that with us.
And one of the interesting things, like, we also kind of contribute to the discourse on language use in the labour market, is also the fact that multilingualism, as it's shown, is the norm rather than the exception. And whether people are working in the hospital, whether people are working in the teaching context, or that's education, or people even in government offices, multilingualism is the norm. Like, in some offices you go and people are competent English speakers, but they often use different indigenous languages. And as you mentioned, Akan, for instance, and other languages like Ewe, Ga, Dagbani, all these languages are having their place in both formal and informal context. So multilingualism has to be celebrated. It has to feature more importantly in our language policies. Even in Parliament, like, the policies stipulate they can be used as a means of translation. But I mean, that is often not seen. But I mean, there is a policy provision, which is very interesting. And then one of the things that I think our research also contributed in terms of finding is one of the points raised in, for instance, GT 2008, regarding the fact that the economic nuances, or the importance of our multilingualism should be captured in terms of looking at its economic values. So people's linguistic repertoire are having one form of or the other economic significance. So, and coupled with education, so it is like multiple things. So people's linguistic repertoire coupled with their educational background would definitely have some implication for their economic maybe freedom, so to say. So these are all nuances that I think our research tried to uncover and also contribute generally to studies on language policy and multilingualism, economics, and of course generally on policies on both fronts. So those are key findings I also think I would like to highlight from our research.
All right, Angela, I see you nodding. You want to add something to that?
Something also that I was thinking as Elvis was speaking, it's relevant to what you've just pointed out as well, Colin, is that either implicitly or explicitly, I think in so many different domains and contexts around the world, multilingualism is often understood as a problem, as something challenging to be overcome rather than seen as a resource, something to be celebrated, supported, better understood. And I think this is what has underpinned a lot of the work that we've done, isn't it? Is trying to bring to the fore the fact that multilingualism so often is the default, is the norm rather than the exception. And using this data, using the work that we've done to try to, celebrate that and encouraging a better valuing, a better response to multilingual realities.
So in the midst of all this, we know that anytime we undertake research, we want to ensure that it's also translates into policy change, or it is able to bring some form of impact on the lives of people. From your findings, did you find out how language policies interact with economic opportunities for Ghanaians? Are there specific sectors or industries where multilingualism plays a crucial role? Okay, Elvis, you want to take this one for me?
And just a quick response to that question, and which ties to our previous discussions on the economic value of multilingualism, looking at it more as a resource. It's the fact that I would say in all facets of life in an average Ghanaian person's, it's multilingual in many ways. Is it going to church? Is it listening to music? I don't know how many music are really monolingual these days. Also, even the English music are full of indigenous languages, and more so that the creative industry even sees the significance of multilingualism. So, for instance, we have movies that are supposed to be in English. Even renowned movies on Netflix, for instance, are multilingual in this day and age, and therefore it shows the strong socioeconomic power that comes with multilingualism. And for other industries, like maybe is it news, education, and maybe law, and I think every aspect, every industry has some significance when it comes to multilingualism. So I think we are getting to a stage in policy making, or generally life, where it's becoming more like a norm, as mentioned earlier on, that multilingualism needs to be celebrated in many ways. And also, I mean, we had interviews with people who are selling on the roadside and who are not living in the context they grew up in. So, for instance, in Accra, highly multilingual, there are some areas that maybe it's not Ghan dominated. So the seller who is having a Ghan background is maybe challenged in a positive way to learn how to speak, for instance, Hausa or Ebe or Dagbani, because the community where they are serving, those are the languages they are using. So an average market woman had to be multilingual to be successful, so to say. And people who do Togo-Ghana border trading are highly multilingual, speaking 5 languages or even more. So I think the economic importance of multilingualism cannot, I would say, be underestimated in this day and age. Yeah.
All right, Colin, I think you have something you want to add on to this.
Just when you're speaking there, let's just like about how multilingualism is the norm, because I mentioned this earlier, but something I come back to in some of my other work is like this idea of sort of like artificial monolingualizing. So just like pretending at policy level and like other aspects of discourse that things are monolingual when they're just not. And then I think what's been good about doing this work and like having this data, and then also part of like the interdisciplinary nature of it, is that I'm not sure what your experiences are of this, but I find when meeting with people like potential stakeholders who are interested in these type of things, having like this kind of hard data, plus also having economists on board who can talk about this sort of stuff, I just find like people tend to listen to economists when they say, oh, we have this sum and this shows us that actually like languages other than English are valuable in the workplace, as opposed to like a linguist saying the same thing, which
but certain disciplines being valued and having perhaps higher prestige status.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, which is, I think, why it's good to work together on things. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. This research is so in-depth and it is very enlightening, and I can identify with almost every part of it because I find myself both in the formal sector and also in the informal sector, and I know how these languages come to play here and then. So I totally agree with all that you found in your research, and we're grateful you shared all of it with us. Thank you so much. But before I let you go, what should we be looking out for from the research team to focus on next year, or subsequently? What's next after this research?
So I am actually just about to start a 2-year project, which is looking at language and the labour market in Malawi. So we're looking specifically at like multilingual skills in informal market settings, so essentially like market traders and things like that. So Kristen, who we worked with on this, is also a partner on that project, and then other colleagues at the University of Malawi. So sort of similar kind of interdisciplinary thing. So we're taking some of the learning from this project and developing a kind of quantitative skills survey that we're going to roll out amongst market traders, and then we're going to combine that with some kind of long-term ethnographic work. Because I suppose for me, this is like the space that I'm interested in working in now. So like thinking about just language in the labour market. So yeah, in 2 years' time, I'll have lots of fun things to talk. And then obviously we need to keep doing stuff in Ghana as well.
I know, definitely. Yeah, that brings like the project we had a follow-up project and on the multilingualism, labour market issues within the informal sector, in which we looking forward to an upcoming paper on that. It's been taking a while because we come working on the paper as well as the data concurrently. So it's going to be interesting to kind of tease out the nuances that we could find it too. But more broadly, I think continuing research, looking at even the area variations, so regional variations or even contextual variations. So for instance, if you go to areas like Zongo communities where we have a number of Hausa speakers, what is the density or what kind of multilingualism is being practiced there? So in these communities, they can speak Hausa. What other languages are they speaking? And what is the significance of English, for instance, in those contexts? So narrowing down the discourse and research on multilingualism, looking at contextual variations, could be something that will be interesting to look at for future projects as well. And also, like in terms of the informal sector project, I mean, we find it very interesting. Like, we know that the GDP growth of a country partly relies on businesses, right? And the informal sector in Ghana, for instance, contribute hugely to the GDP growth of the country. And when we explore the linguistic repertoire of people who are working within the informal sector, English is important, but it's very obvious that the indigenous languages are extremely important. And also the fact that most of the market sellers are multilingual. So they speak strong economic languages like Akan, and Gan, Ewe, Dagbani, and a lot, Hausa, all these languages. We even realize that foreign languages like French is playing a role in those contexts. So, and I think there are a few people who also speak languages, and from Nigeria, for instance, or Yoruba, Igbo speakers. So we can see the varied and then the complexity and the beauty of multilingualism playing a strong economic contribution to these contexts. So I think we're looking at the comparison between formal and informal context and narrowing down to the nuances in terms of community of practice could also be things that will be of interest to the research on language and the labour market.
All right, beautiful submissions from all of you, and we are looking forward to tapping into what next the team is going to do. I must say, I'm very impressed about the knowledge you have shared with me and also with my listeners, and we're very excited about it. I know this is going to go a long way to change work ethics and work environment in both the formal and informal environment or informal workplaces that we find ourselves, and I'm very excited about it. In fact, your presence on Africa's LSP podcast has been truly invaluable, and we'll make sure to provide our listeners with links to your LinkedIn profiles and to sites where they can find the research. Thank you once again for your time and contribution.
That's us. Yeah. Before we go, I think we had to acknowledge our founder at the time, right? We were ably sponsored or kind of supported by the Global Challenges Fund, Research Fund through the University of Glasgow. So yeah, thank you for the funding as well. That made it possible for our travels and all our impact for how we had in Ghana as well. So thank you to the funders.
Yes. So, listeners, this is how we wrap up on our beautiful conversation on multilingualism and how it's plays out on the local or Ghanaian job markets. My name again is Grace Hamwa Ajiman.
Thanks for tuning in to Africa's LSP podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and learned something new. For feedback or enquiries, reach out to us at podcast@bolingoconsult.com. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platforms. Until next time, stay curious and keep growing.